Welcome back. You're watching Gravitas. An old and evil ghost has reared his head again. Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf, or My Struggle, has been republished for the first time since World War II. The departure from what was considered a taboo in post-World War II Germany has raised concern that the publication of the xenophobic treatise will encourage the further progress of right-wing parties across Europe. But its publishers, the Institute of Contemporary History in Munich, say that the purpose is to reignite a debate on the dangers of right-wing nationalism. Our senior international correspondent, Padma Rao, has this report.
He was a tyrant, a murderer whose intolerant regime brutally exterminated 6 million Jewish men, women and children. And he was a megalomaniac whose ambitions to conquer the world caused the near ruin and abject devastation of Germany. But such were the times that Adolf Hitler's autobiography, Mein Kampf, or My Struggle, was a bestseller that by the end of World War II in 1945 had sold 12 million copies and been translated into 18 languages. The Allies banned the book after the end of the war, but it's back and making waves of a different kind across Germany ever since its republication last year.
Also ich denke, einerseits kommen die Leute natürlich immer irgendwie dran, da bringt das Verbot nicht viel. Ich kenne jetzt viele Leute, die das irgendwie als Hörbuch hatten oder sogar in der Schule teilweise kriegen. Aber ich finde, man sollte das nicht unterstützen, so ein Buch mit solchem Inhalt, das völkerrechtsfeindlich ist und dergleichen, indem man es öffentlich zugänglich macht, weil ich sehe das als Unterstützung, was vielleicht nicht sehr ethnisch korrekt ist.
The Allies gave the state of Bavaria the copyright of the book after Hitler's defeat. And the publishing house, in turn, refused to allow its publication for 70 years out of respect for victims of the Holocaust and to prevent it being used as a Bible of sorts by right-wing extremists. But a 2,000-page annotated version was published last year and has already sold 85,000 copies. The publishers at Munich's Institute of Contemporary History are surprised by its success, but not unduly worried.
Edition mit Standpunkt heißt, wir wollen natürlich eine kritische Edition, also sozusagen eine Edition, deren Grundhaltung davon geprägt ist, Hitler zu widerlegen, Hitler ins Wort zu fallen, Hitler richtig zu stellen.
The German fundamentalist party Alternative für Deutschland, already represented in 10 regional parliaments, looks poised to make it to the national one, the Bundestag, after general elections next year. The fortunes of other right-wing factions too are on the rise. There is anger and criticism of Chancellor Angela Merkel's refugee policy that has admitted tens of thousands on the run from war and unrest in Syria and North Africa. But given the horrific memories of World War II, passed on down through 3 generations of Germans, it is quite certain that Mein Kampf will never emerge as the last word in nation building, but remain, at best, a morbid curiosity. Padma Rao, WION.
The horrors of World War II and Nazi Germany are going to stay on people's minds for many centuries to come. The persecution of the Jews, and certainly what happened through the war around the world, millions of lives lost, is going to continue to haunt us. Padma, you talked about resurrection of the right wing in Europe, and we are seeing through many elections, even through Brexit, even in the UK, we're seeing rise of right-wingism. Explain to us, is there any sign that these books are being sold and people are buying into the ideology that maybe Hitler was right?
Rohit, I would tend to agree with the professor that you just heard on the package, that there is an academic interest, and let's not forget there have been 2 generations born after Second World War who had actually very little to do with with the Holocaust and with the Nazi era. Yet each and every German has always been very conscious of their very disturbed past and have done their best, even throughout my years as a student in Germany, to ensure that foreigners feel welcome. And I speak of the 70s and 80s. But yes, I have always noticed that the Germans have a strong sense of self-flagellation. It's almost as if, they want to repeatedly, almost like a ritual, repeat to themselves that they may never forget the horrors of the war. So I think that is what is going to prevent this book from being anything else other than an academic study or at best a curiosity.
Padma, when we've seen through the last few months, there have been tremendous amount of voices against Merkel. They let a lot of Syrians in and certainly a lot of other nationalities in. And Merkel has faced some backlash because of that. Do you think that would have changed the heart of a lot of Germans, or do you think they continue to stand as liberal Democrats?
I think Germany is, tends to be a very liberal society, whether they vote conservative or whether they actually vote socialist. And Rohit, that the current government is a coalition government. In fact, a grand coalition, one of the few of its kind in the world, between the Social Democrats and the ruling Christian Democrats, who are really the centrist conservatives. So I think that power is most likely to remain within that constellation, if not a clean sweep for the CDU itself. But that again is unlikely because of the criticism that Angela Merkel has come under due to her taking on so many thousands of refugees. But yes, there will be the chances for the Alternative für Deutschland, the right-wing party, will certainly be improved, and they hope to make it to the Bundestag, the national parliament, when elections are held in the coming year.
Thank you, Padma. That's our senior international correspondent, Padma Rao. Joining us in this discussion now is Dr. Markus Pinder. He's the federal correspondent from Berlin. Professor Magnus Brechken, Deputy Director of the Institute of Contemporary Studies and History, also joining us from Berlin. And later on the show, we also have Anita Bose-Boff. She's Subhash Chandra Bose's daughter. Now, let me start by asking you, Professor Magnus Brechken, you republished Mein Kampf exactly a year ago. What made you decide to republish after 70 years of refusing to do so?
Well, the reason was that the copyright expired. All texts by Hitler between the period of 1905 and 1933 had been published in critical editions before. So everything that had been written by Hitler or published by Hitler before 1933 was available for public discourse and for research in a critical edition. And there was just this one gap, namely Mein Kampf. And we had to fill this gap to fill and answer the demand of an academic public, but also of the wider general public who are interested in learning more about this historical document.
Dr. Pindawa, do you envisage any danger to the social fabric of Germany by this republication of what is essentially a xenophobic book?
I cannot quite see that because it's a great scientific edition. It really is a marvelous book. It's more, the text is one thing. The text of Mein Kampf is one thing. But what the Institute for Contemporary History has made out of it is basically a thesaurus of historical annotations. And so you can't really take this book into your hands and really adore Nazism or Hitler with it, because it gives you also, and everybody who buys that book and looks into that book, and every student who does that, it gives you a lot of context, it gives you a lot of historical annotations, and it's really it's a brilliant edition, and the Institute for Contemporary History is one of our best historical institutions in Germany. There's no doubt about that.
Dr. Brechken, what purpose will this republication achieve from your perspective?
It has given anyone who is interested in the history of National Socialism and the history of the 20th century an opportunity to get information on Mein Kampf, but also on the roots of its ideology on a research-based level 70 years after the war. There has been a plethora of research over the decades. Our institute was founded specifically after the war to investigate and research the origins and the reasons for National Socialism. So we've published several thousand books since then and have had several thousand other articles and critical contributions to the historical research, and this is reflected in the comments which were just mentioned. We have about 3,700 annotations in the book, all of them more or less little essays which give the reader who is interested in the historical background an opportunity to get information on the first-hand information, and then also delve deeper into the literature and the research if he or she wishes to do so.
Dr. Bretschken, do you think right-wing organizations like, let's say, the AfD or the Pegida are going to try and glorify this book and use it in their campaigns?
Well, I would say it's just the opposite. I should mention, commenting on what was said before, that the book was never banned and it was never forbidden. You mentioned that 12 million copies were printed before 1945, and several hundred thousands of these copies have survived. And until last year and at the present day still, you could buy original copies from these 12 million which have survived in antiquarian bookshops or landed in libraries, etc. So the book and the text was always available. The same is true for the English version. The copyright for English was sold in 1933 already. There have been 3 translations, and they have never been out of print since 1933. So the text of Mein Kampf has always been available in its original and in its original translation. But what has missed so far was a critical version of the text. That's what we produce, and that's why everyone who might be a fan or adherent to NS ideology will not be happy, but very unhappy with our book, because we provide a deconstruction of this NS ideology.
Sure. Dr. Pindawa, do you want to respond to that question as well?
I tend to agree with Professor Bretschken, and I might add that the AfD, the so-called Alternative for Germany, it's a right-wing populist party that deals in right-wing extremism and populism, and is kind of always trying not to be painted as a neo-Nazi party. So they will go to great lengths not to be associated with that book, and they will certainly not use it for propaganda purposes, because what most people by now say, that they have a lot of right-wing followers and right-wing extremists among their followers, is something that they desperately deny, because they do not want to be associated with Nazism, and they do not want to be painted as a right-wing extremist neo-Nazi party. So I can't really see that the publication of this excellent book really does something to tear at our political and social fabric here in Germany. I think it was time to have such an edited and edition, and it's really more of an encyclopedia about National Socialism than it is the actual original text.
I want to ask this question to both of you. You know, just in the last 2 days, the Indian Supreme Court has gone out and ruled that you can't use caste and you can't use religion as a way for asking for votes. Now, in Germany, is there a law that prevents people from using Nazism as a way for asking for votes?
You are not allowed to use... Sorry.
Mr. Brexit, you take it first, and then Pindawa, you can answer.
Okay. Well, there are laws against the use of National Socialist symbols, and this kind of allusion to National Socialist ideas is rather ostracized, quite rightly so, and the present-day German society reacts rather sensitive to such issues. So there is always there has always been some small groups of extremism, both on the left and on the right, and they both have anti-democratic and anti-parliamentarian views, but these groups on the left and on the right tend to be normally on the margins and not represented in the parliamentary process. And we will have to see whether some of the anti-parliamentarian or anti-democratic movements will gain access to parliaments. But at the current level of our democratic voting system, this is not the case.
Mr. Pindawa, do you want to take that?
Yes. National socialist symbols are outlawed, as the professor just rightly said. Plus, there are laws on hate speech in Germany too, like in many liberal democratic societies, like in India, for example, too. We have laws against incendiary speech and hate speech, but they are not easily applied, which is the right thing in a liberal society. And plus, we have laws that outlaw Holocaust denial. So, as a matter of fact, the neo-Nazis, German neo-Nazis, whenever they wanted to discuss the Holocaust and make it a topic, they flew in so-called historians from abroad, mainly from Britain and from the United States, who would do the business of Holocaust denial and then somehow vanish. So there's speech, there's rules against that, against Holocaust denial, and that's very strictly enforced.
Dr. Pindawa, there has been some tremendous amount of backlash against the Syrians. That said, obviously, there are tremendous amount of Syrians that have been taken into Germany. Can you explain to me, after many months of the turmoil, is there a little bit of a backlash that people don't want more Syrians to come in, or they don't want the nature of Germany to change in any way?
It's still a struggle, and people are still coming to grips with what is actually happening. But see, 1 in every 10 Germans is somehow involved in helping refugees, in helping them in their communities. They are somewhat engaged in dealing with families, helping them through the bureaucracy, getting school education for the children. So there's a lot of engagement, private engagement in Germany going on for these refugees. On the other hand, of course, it makes people think twice. I mean, it has been now 800,000 people who came into the country. We had that before. We had that in the 1990s with refugees from Yugoslavia, and we dealt with that too. So we can do this, but it makes people, a lot of people uncomfortable, that's for sure, and it makes people think twice. And there is this one party that we just talked about that is trying to capitalize on that and get their xenophobic point of view out in the public, and they have had some success with it. Their potential is between 10 and 20% of the electorate. So it remains to be seen how strong they will be in the Bundestag after our parliamentary elections in September. There is no doubt that there will be a voice of xenophobia in Parliament in September, because, as I said, between 10 and 20% of the people are potential voters.
Sure, there certainly has been a move in Europe and also in North America. A little more xenophobia has been seen. Let us take now a historical look at how the relationship between South Asia, in fact, Subhash Chandra Bose, and between Hitler unfolded. In the year 1931, prominent freedom fighter from Bengal almost struck an unlikely pact in order to overthrow the British colonial rulers of India, one with German dictator Adolf Hitler. The attempted pact was more due to realpolitik than a sense of ideological bonding, and ultimately never took place. But a controversy over the attempted liaison persists in India even today, 70 years after India gained independence from the British. But what do Indians, young and old, know or think of Adolf Hitler today? Let's listen in.
Did was amazing. Yes, he was cruel, but he tried to unite his country and he fought against people who had degraded him and his country.
He had this enigma in him through which he could control a population and make them do go about in a particular way, which I find very admirable.
He was a dictator, and there was a time when all the countries were under him.
He started Nazism in Germany. He was he did a lot of atrocities against Jews, and he was not a good man, I would say.
I was in Iraq a few years ago, and I asked one of the doctors what he thought of the dictatorship of Saddam Hussein. He said, "I could not explain it to you. Until you actually live under a dictator, you would never understand. You couldn't even eat on a newspaper, because if you ate on a newspaper, the next thing you'd do, and it had a photo of Saddam Hussein, they'd pick you up and you'd never be seen again for your family." So when you look back at it 70 years later, certainly a very different perspective. Thank you so much, Dr. Brechken and Dr. Pindawa, for joining me on this show tonight. Clearly, the enigma of Adolf Hitler endures even today. That is all we have in this edition of Gravitas. For news and updates from South Asia and around the world, keep watching WION. Good night and good luck.